The question everyone is asking is, will this year's El Niño end California's current drought? And regardless, has government done enough to adequately respond to the current drought and prepare for the inevitable next drought? We'll ask Rachel Ehlers, an expert on water issues with the California Legislative Analyst Office; Alvar Escriva-Bou, an international water policy expert with the Public Policy Institute of California; and Dan Walters, the Sacramento Bee's columnist who covers state politics. El Niño and the drought, just in time or too little too late?
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world, and by Kaiser Permanente. Thrive. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Everyone knows that California is in a drought, but just how bad is the state's water situation? And will this year's El Niño be enough to declare an end to the state's drought? Our guest is Rachel Ehlers, an expert in water issues with the California Legislative Analyst Office. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So California's been experiencing a pretty serious drought for the past 4 years, but according to some of the stuff that you've written, the drought's actually been going on a lot longer than that, all the way back to 2007, and we had one wet year, 2011, in the middle. So from an historical context, just how bad has this drought been?
You know, it's been pretty bad. The state certainly has had droughts in the past. We have dry cycles and wet cycles, so from that perspective, it's not unusual. But this drought has set some records. The past 4 years have been pretty dry, as you noted. They've actually been the fourth consecutive dry years, the driest 4 consecutive years on record since the state started measuring in the late 1800s. And they've also been pretty hot.
Right.
The past 2 years have been the 2 hottest on record.
And you start seeing some of these maps of as it's kind of expanded across the state. Every year it gets a little worse and worse and worse and worse.
That's right.
You know, we're hearing an awful lot about El Niño. How much have the recent storms actually improved conditions? Can we declare the drought over?
No, I don't think so. The governor declared the drought state of emergency, so I guess he's the one to declare it over, but I don't think anyone is ready to make that kind of declaration. January was pretty wet. That was encouraging, above average rain and snow, but it's kind of trickled off since then, so jury's still out about what 2016 will be, how wet it will be, but at this stage our reservoirs are well below average across the state. Our groundwater levels are quite depleted, so kind of the hole we're in, it would take quite a bit, and we haven't seen it yet. Yeah,
you know, the reservoirs really have not increased like we'd like to see them increase. I guess we'll wait and see what the snowpack is and make that determination. Given the research on climate change, are we going to see more frequent and more severe droughts? Is this the new normal? Well,
this is what a lot of the science is suggesting, and a lot of it has to do with those warming temperatures. As I mentioned, the past few years have been really warm. The state traditionally has counted on our snowpack as one of our major sources of water throughout the year as it gradually melts, but with these warmer temperatures, we're getting more rain rather than snow, and then what snow we do get is melting faster.
Right, because it gets warmer, you get some snow and it gets warmer.
And the soils are drier, so it's absorbing into the soils, the plants are soaking up more, all of that decreases the runoff, and demand is also higher for water when it's warmer, both in agricultural and urban settings. So I think there are some concerning signs that this could be a sign of what's to come.
The new normal. Well, can you explain, I mean, people live in different parts of the state. Sometimes they're kind of isolated. They don't really understand what's happening in other parts of the state. So what has the impact been on the drought on like the ag industry in the Central Valley, or on water quality in some of the small rural communities, or on the environment, or even in urban areas?
Yeah, it really has varied across different areas of the state. The agricultural sector, as you mentioned, is typically really dependent on a lot of those surface water deliveries that start up in the mountains and come down to them through.
They say that the water's north, but the demand is south.
That's right. The demand is middle and south. That's right. That's right. And so the agricultural sector has had to fallow farm fields, purchase water for pretty high rates, but really one of the main strategies upon which they've relied is groundwater pumping, which has been a great strategy, but kind of isn't sustainable for the long term. And really we've seen some concerning signs about some of the impacts of that groundwater pumping, including land subsidence, land sinking.
The land is actually sinking. So just quickly, the implications of that are the land is sinking, then roads sink, canals sink.
That's right.
Train tracks sink,
That's
houses,
right.
and
bridges. Yes,
yeah.
Right. And the underground geology is somewhat that it can't come back.
Right. I mean, I remember talking to someone from the Geological Service a while ago, and they were saying that, you know, once you take the water out, those rocks Well, the aquifer, they collapse.
The clay, that's right.
And then you don't have that space anymore.
That's right. So there's concerns about how that can continue. In urban areas where residents live, the primary experience has been really to have to cut back on water use. The state passed a requirement to reduce water use by 25%. Compared to 2013. So there have also been mandatory restrictions on outdoor watering, but also a lot of encouragement to take shorter showers along with that. But then, as you mentioned, some of the more rural communities, the impacts have been pretty severe from, in some cases, domestic wells going dry, so really losing water. And similarly, the impacts to the environment have been very concerning. Some of our endangered species, rivers and streams getting warmer or drying up completely, forests drying, trees dying.
I was reading in your report about the trees. It's an amazing number. U.S. Forest Service says 29 million trees have died.
Right, and that's several months old at this point. So
it's more than that.
And that has led to some of the really intense and severe wildfires that we've seen as well in recent years.
So it's all a system. One impacts the other, obviously.
Right.
Well, thank you for that summary of California's current drought. Up next, what is the federal, state, and local government response to the drought, and has it been enough? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome. We're talking with Rachel Ehlers, an expert on water issues with the California Legislative Analyst's Office, about the government's response to the drought. So let's talk about the federal government. What have they done to respond to the drought?
Well, they've provided some funding. Estimates are around $500 million has come to the state from the federal government over the past couple years, and really have coordinated very closely with state government, state agencies in a lot of their response. But really, they've been kind of deferring to the state to take the lead.
Okay, let's talk about, we're going to get to the state in a second. Let's talk about local governments, though, for a moment. How have they responded to the drought?
Yeah, most of the local government response has been around this state requirement to reduce water usage by 25%.
And they did hit the target initially. It was like 25.5%. I don't know if they're still doing that well, but initially they seem to be hitting the target.
Yeah, I mean, it was a multi-month target.
Sometimes good, sometimes not so good.
Everybody knew that the reductions would be bigger in the warmer months because that's when we use most of our water outside for outdoor watering, and that it would decrease in the winter. So I think we're getting close to that 25%. We'll see.
I want to say about half of the urban use is outdoor watering.
I think it's even more than half.
It's quite a bit.
So that's really one of the areas that the state has targeted and that local governments targeted as well.
And that's where you're seeing a lot of people, at least in my neighborhood, they're taking out their lawns. And
that's right. Yeah, that's right. And some of these local governments actually even use local funding to help encourage and incentivize some of that, giving grants for folks to take out their lawns and replace appliances, that sort of thing.
Okay. Now, you talk about the state's response as being multifaceted. Explain.
Yeah, it's been very widespread. The state has provided about $3 billion over the past several years for drought response activities across 13 different state departments and agencies. It's multi. And the activities have really varied in nature. Some have been really emergency response, both for humans living in drought-affected
water quality
communities,
issues,
bringing drinking water and drinking water tanks to areas where domestic wells have gone dry, but also job assistance and housing assistance and
a lot of that is in the San Joaquin Valley.
That's right. That's right. That's where some of the impacts have been felt the most. There's also been kind of emergency, urgent response for environmental impacts of the drought. In some cases, even trucking fish from streams to fish hatcheries where special chillers have been installed to help them survive. And then obviously very big fire response as well. But the state's also invested in water conservation activities, increasing efficiency at state buildings and farm fields, and then also really undertaken some widespread, long-term, bigger infrastructure projects that probably won't really affect this drought, but could help in the future. Things like water recycling, wastewater treatment grants, primarily funded with Proposition 1, which is the water bond that voters passed in 2014. So it really has been a kind of a multifaceted, widespread response.
They've also actually reduced their water delivery, some of the state water project.
That's right.
As well, and that's been a big drop-off, and I think farmers are concerned about that. What about the governor's drought response in his current budget?
Yeah, so he's got $323 million in the proposal for the upcoming year, and about 2/3 of that would continue a lot of these urgent, emergency kind of responses, both for humans and for the environment and for fires, really in those kind of three categories. But about $90 million of that proposal is for some new water and energy efficiency programs that would be funded through the state's greenhouse gas reduction program.
And those have long-term implications because they continue to conserve water in years in the future.
That's right. I think that's
I don't
the
think anybody's
intention.
expecting that droughts aren't going to happen in California's future. I think people are saying it's more likely they are going to happen,
That's
maybe even
right.
more frequently.
That's right, and I think that's part of the state's response has been throughout this is both short-term and thinking more longer-term.
So I'm just wondering, what is the LAO's assessment of the governor's budget proposals on the drought?
Yeah, so given the indications that this drought, at least the impacts will continue at least to some degree in the coming year, we think it makes sense to prepare for that, particularly those urgent emergency responses. For some of the water and energy efficiency proposals, we think there needs to be a little bit more information that the legislature will need to evaluate those and see if that's the most effective use of those funds. But preparing for continued drought, we think at this point makes sense.
So when you're talking about legislature needs to take a closer look at things, you're talking about the cap and trade funds and how they're being used to deal with water issues.
That's right.
Is that the issue? And your concern there is what, maybe not the most efficient?
Well, I think we just need some more information. What are the expected outcomes of these programs? It's really that nexus between water efficiency but also energy efficiency, using less energy. But
so that kind of gets us to the LAO's recommendations. So you've got a few drought-related recommendations. What are they?
We are recommending that the legislature approve the governor's emergency urgent response proposals, preparing for continued drought. We're kind of holding off on those cap and trade funded proposals until we get some more information to find out if that's the most effective use of the funds. But we're also recommending the legislature not lose this opportunity to prepare for future droughts. As you mentioned, I think we know throughout history droughts reoccur, but given the suggestion that droughts maybe continue to be intense in the future, what have we learned from our response to this drought? What additional policy changes could we put in place now to help facilitate responses in the future? What didn't go so well during this drought that we can kind of prepare for. So I think we just want to be sure that we don't lose this opportunity, even while we're still in the midst of some crisis.
Yeah, you're looking at the long term and
right.
preparing for that, so the next drought maybe won't be as severe in terms of implications on the population.
Yeah, at least we're better prepared to handle it.
Great. Well, thank you. Rachel Ehlers with the Legislative Analyst Office for that summary of federal, state, and local response to the current drought. Up next, when it comes to water storage, will we ever catch up, or is it just too little too late at this point? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Our next guest is Alvar Escriva-Bou, a research fellow with the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California, their Water Policy Center, and an international expert on water issues. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you so much, Mark, for having me here.
Well, let's talk about the implications of rain as opposed to snowpack. What's the difference there?
We're seeing that we are having more rain and less snow lately. This is because we're increasing, the temperatures are increasing. So
That climate change people are talking about. Perhaps, okay.
There are some kind of different implications for California. What we will see is that we will have more water when we less need it. It's in the winter. Mm-hmm. And we have less water when we actually use it, but it's in the summer. So we'll have to manage to differently the way that we manage right now our reservoirs. So
because we counted on the snowpack before, right? That's not going to be the situation going forward. You know, there's this discussion about water storage, and there's discussion about above ground or below ground. So, you know, a below ground would be like water banking. You pump the water into the ground. The above ground would be dams or reservoirs. I'm just wondering, which is more cost-effective way to store water?
I think that we don't have to go into rivalries between one or the other, but we have to assess both cases in a serious way. Like, we have all these costs. Dams are expensive. Dams have environmental costs. So pumping groundwater in a continuous way from the ground, it's also expensive. But
yeah, people don't remember that cost, right? You have to pump it out of the ground in and out.
It looks like we have developed a lot. We have more than 1,400 surface reservoirs in California, so that's a lot. We have few places to build a cost-effective dam right now. But even though we have to assess both things, we have to assess costs and also benefits. And when we talk about benefits, it's not the benefits of this last drought that it has been really damaging. It's long-term benefits. Mm-hmm. Even the years that we have a lot of water, we don't have many costs. So these long-term benefits have to be assessed and compared with the cost that we have. You
know, there's been a lot of, because of the drought, a lot of groundwater pumping. I'm just wondering, what are the implications of groundwater pumping during the drought? Yeah,
it has helped a lot. We have offset most of our surface shortage in many places in California. And we have to say as well that not every basin is overdrafted. Not every basin is in a critical situation. There's many places in California where we have been pumping groundwater in a kind of sustainable way, but there are some regions where we have problems. Mostly in the Tulare Basin, in the
San Joaquin Valley has got some issues. Yeah.
Salinas, some issues also in Salinas. So, in these places, we have to try. There have been many problems. We have two big problems. The first one is that shallow wells went dry, and this is an economical problem for farmers, but it's a socio-economical problem also for rural communities that more than 3,000 domestic wells went dry last year.
They go dry. There's no water there. So then water's got to be trucked in or whatever.
And the second implication is like land subsidence. We are having this land sinking, and we're having a lot of economic costs for large infrastructure, roads, buildings, and others. And we have to
so the water is in between the clay or rock or whatever, and then when the water goes away, that collapses, and then the whole ground collapses, and then roads, canals, buildings.
It's millions of costs potential millions of costs in that.
I'm thinking probably billions. It might even be, depending on how bad it is.
Yes,
so there's been some state legislation to kind of address this issue, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and regions are supposed to adopt and start implementing plans to manage groundwater beginning in 2020. I'm just wondering, is it too little, too late?
It's the first time that the state is regulating groundwater, so that's a first. That's a big step ahead. So that's the first point. And the second is that not every basin, as I said before, it's overdrafted. We have some problems, and these basins that are overdrafted have to start moving quickly. The way that they are implementing this plan is to be managed by locals. Right. So there's a lot of, communities have to be created. They have to develop their plans. So we need some time for that. So I think it's. We have seen as well that they are already working on that. There are these communities that are really damaged, that they are starting to work with this because it's for their own benefit.
So it's going to take some time.
Yeah,
obviously.
It's going to take.
Well, I want to thank our guest, Alvar Escriva-Bou with the PPIC's Water Policy Center. Up next, the politics of water with the Sacramento Bee's Dan Walters. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. When someone wants to get an insight on the politics of important state issues like water, Dan Walters of the Sacramento Bee is usually the go-to source. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark.
So before we start talking about water politics at the state capitol, I want to ask you about water politics in Washington. Senator Feinstein has tried yet again to broker a deal for water at the federal level. Any chance of that happening this time?
I think unless you have a consensus within California, you're not going to get something through Congress. The rest of Congress, the rest of the Senate, the rest of the House is going to look at things and say, have you got all your stuff together in California? Or is this something you're trying to shove down somebody's throat in California? And until you have that kind of consensus, I don't think it's going to happen in Washington. And you also have the situation that in pairing with John Garamendi, Garamendi's very much opposed to the peripheral canals, to the Delta tunnels. And
going back a few years.
That becomes a complicating factor. I mean, how can you avoid that issue if you're doing a water bill? And that becomes a kind of a roadblock as well.
Well, let's talk about those twin tunnels and stuff. You see different numbers. $15 billion is probably an appropriate number as any for that project, this twin tunnels project the governor is pushing for the Delta. Currently, though, there's an initiative being pushed by a wealthy Stockton area farmer and food processor, which would require voter approval before the state could issue revenue bonds for any project of more than $2 billion.
Yes.
Could that sink the Twin Tunnels project?
It probably would sink the Twin Tunnels project because it's unlikely that you could get approval for those bonds on a statewide basis.
I mean, isn't that the whole point of using revenue bonds, so you don't have to get the voter approval?
Yes, it is one of the points of using revenue bonds. Also, you don't tap the taxpayers to repay the bonds. That's the ostensible reason for it. However, there are a couple of factors. Number one, the use of revenue bonds has kind of been twisted in recent years, and a lot of revenue bonds aren't really revenue bonds. For example, we build prisons with revenue bonds, and the only source of revenue for those revenue bonds is the lease payments paid by the state. So the state pays the state, and under the subterfuge of using revenue bonds because they want to avoid public votes. Mm-hmm. And the governor and the other advocates of the tunnels do not want a public vote on those tunnels because they know probably they would lose. So the idea is to do it without a vote, and this would essentially require a vote. However, that's not the beginning and the end of the troubles for these tunnels. The reluctance of the major water agencies in the San Joaquin Valley and the Southern California seems to be growing. They're becoming weary of this.
Because they would be paying for this under normal circumstances.
They would be paying for it, and they're starting to see, what are we getting for our money? And it's particularly interesting, one of the interesting things coming out of the drought is in Southern California is becoming less and less dependent on Northern California water. They have figured it out.
More conservation,
desalination, more storage, wastewater recycling, and so forth. And the more they become independent, the less they are needing those tunnels to give them water reliability. And then the farmers down in the Westlands Water District are getting a little upset with the idea that we're going to cost them a lot of money. They're already strapped because of the money they've had to pay for water to get through the drought, and they're feeling the financial pinch, and they're becoming very reluctant to put up more money for these things.
Let me ask you about another thing that's being circulated for the November ballot, and that is this proposal that would divert money from the 2008 California High-Speed Rail bond and the 2014 water bond into a new water authority. Surprisingly, there are quite a few powerful ag and water groups that are voicing opposition to this. Why?
Well, they worked out a deal on the water bond that was passed by the voters a couple of years ago, and they don't want to upset that apple cart. They've got something finally after years of trying, and they don't want to take a chance that it might be upset if you introduce this new element of the bullet train bonds into the equation. On the other hand, if that thing makes the ballot, it's going to have a lot of momentum behind it. The people don't like the bullet train. The bullet train has lost favor with the voters of California. And if they would look at it...
It's about a 50-50 split.
Yeah, they would look at it as a chance to kill the bullet train, as opposed to...
They're saying that's not the reason.
Oh, of course not. But that's really what's going on here. And it's the sort of thing, yeah, I can understand why the farmers wouldn't like it, but on the other hand, I could see that thing passing. I really could see that thing passing.
You know, one thing you mentioned in an article you wrote recently is that the state's water needs are kind of, there's a conflict as to whether we should be just saying, listen, deal with a limited water supply, start conserving, or increase the water supply. That seems to be the conflict. So, you know, politics is all about the art of compromise. So where's the sweet spot on that issue?
Well, presumably there is a sweet spot, but they haven't found it yet. When you start talking about water, the most important thing to remember is the fighting over water in California is not over water. The fighting over water in California is over land use, because the land use is dependent on water, whether it's agricultural land or whether it's urban land, it's dependent on water supply. So when all of these conflicts over water are surrogates for conflicts over how California is going to develop or not develop land. And you get into this issue of supply versus conservation. That's where that land use thing really hits, because new uses for land require new sources of water. And if you don't have those new sources of water, you can't develop the land. And a lot of environmental groups don't want to develop a land, ergo they don't want to have new sources of water, and they beat the conservation drum very, very strongly. Probably we ought to be talking about not necessarily new supply versus conservation, but we ought to probably be talking about reallocating the supply that we have already and start looking at things like water rights. I know that just kills some farmers. Water rights and that sort of thing to rationalize the use of water rather than trying to build something on what is kind of an irrational basis.
You just open up a whole new Pandora's box.
It's the next thing. After groundwater regulation, the next frontier of water in California will be water rights.
And I'm sure we'll be addressing that. I want to thank Dan Walters from Sacramento Bee for joining us. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can check us out on Twitter or Facebook, or take a look at our website for the Maddy Daily, our free e-newsletter on state politics. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.